All right, let's get into it. You know how after every big State of the Union address, the commentary and the analysis that follows is almost as big a deal as the speech itself? Well, that's exactly what we're digging into today. Specifically, a breakdown of how commentators like Judge Joe Brown reacted to one of Donald Trump's addresses. We're going to look at what they thought of the speech, the wild reactions in the room, and the bigger picture they saw unfolding.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at their initial take on the speech itself. Was it any good? Then we'll get into the tale of two parties and their totally different reactions. After that, we'll unpack the mix of actual policy and what they called political showmanship. We'll also cover this war on fraud idea and wrap it all up with their, well, let's just say a very blunt final verdict.
Okay, so first things first. What did the commentators notice right off the bat? Interestingly, it wasn't a specific policy point. It was all about the performance.
Judge Joe Brown kicked things off by pointing out, this was the longest State of the Union address on record. But for him, that wasn't the main story. The real takeaway was that it was actually entertaining. He said it had humor, and most importantly, it wasn't boring. It kept you watching. But, according to Judge Brown, there was this one specific moment, a crux of the matter, as he called it, that happened pretty early on. He believed this one single line basically set the stage for the entire night. And this was it. This was the quote the commentators latched onto. They saw this as the core message of the whole speech. In their view, this principle drew a line in the sand, and everything that came after it, all the applause and all the stone-faced silence, was a reaction to this one idea. And that brings us perfectly to the next part of their analysis, what was actually happening inside the chamber. They really focused on the visual, the massive contrast between the two parties. For these analysts, it was all about the optics. It wasn't just what was being said from the podium, but who was standing, who was clapping, and who was sitting on their hands. And what did all of that body language really mean? This slide really captures the stark divide they were talking about. They described this scene where Republicans were constantly on their feet, giving sustained applause. Meanwhile, they used some pretty, let's say, vivid language for the Democrats, describing them as zombies with surly looks on their faces who just stayed in their seats. Now, one commentator had a pretty bold interpretation for why Democrats were acting that way. He argued it wasn't some kind of principled silent protest. He actually called it cowardice, suggesting that they were all just looking at each other, waiting for a signal on how they were supposed to react.
To back this up, the commentators highlighted these specific moments. They pointed out that, in their observation, Democrats didn't applaud for the idea that American citizens should come first, or for honoring a young crime victim, or even for recognizing military veterans. They used these examples to build their larger argument that the Democratic Party's platform was just completely out of step with what they called common sense.
Okay, so let's shift from the reactions to the actual policy. The commentators also dug into the specific economic tools that were talked about in the speech, especially the idea of using trade as a strategic weapon.
So, to set the scene, they did a quick little history lesson on tariffs, the taxes you put on imports. They explained that, traditionally in the U.S., these were used to protect American industries and make sure there were high-paying jobs for American workers.
Judge Brown then laid out what he saw as the economic power the president still had, even after a court ruling had limited some actions on tariffs. He pointed to things like imposing quotas to limit imports, using a full-blown embargo to cut off trade, or negotiating new international treaties.
And here's the crucial point they made. It wasn't just about actually using these economic tools. They argued that the mere threat of using them was an incredibly powerful foreign policy move. They claimed it was used to de-escalate conflicts and stop potential wars in several hot spots around the globe.
All right, let's turn to another huge theme from the speech that the commentators really unpacked, this idea of a new war on fraud, targeting government spending programs right here at home.
The whole discussion was anchored around this one jaw-dropping number, $19 billion. And they said this figure came from just a single case of alleged fraud in Minnesota.
The commentators used this number as their Exhibit A for why a war on fraud was necessary. They framed it as this massive, unbelievable theft of taxpayer money, which to them showed just how big the problem had become. So when this line was delivered in the State of the Union, they saw it as the formal declaration, a direct response to exactly the kind of large-scale corruption they were just talking about. But then Judge Brown took it a step further. He made the very serious claim that some of this fraud money might have actually funded terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
He also argued that under federal law, so-called sanctuary cities are a felony, but that these laws just weren't being enforced against officials.
So, after all that, what was the final judgment? How did these commentators sum up their view of the whole event? Well, they definitely didn't hold back. Yep. To give their final verdict, they pulled out this very blunt quote, which they attributed to the sports analyst Stephen A. Smith. They felt it was the perfect way to describe the entire State of the Union spectacle.
But, and this is key, Judge Brown was very specific about what he meant by shit show. He said it wasn't the speech itself. He argued the real show was the reaction from the Democrats, a performance he saw as totally illogical and driven by an agenda designed to undermine traditional American values.
So when you boil it all down, the final point for these commentators was this. What they witnessed that night wasn't just a simple disagreement over policy. To them, it exposed a fundamental, maybe even unbridgeable, divide between two totally different worldviews and sets of values.
And that's really the final question this leaves us with, isn't it? When political analysis frames the divide not as a debate over ideas, but as an irreconcilable clash of fundamental values, what does that really tell us about the state of our political conversation today? Thanks for joining me.